In the early 1990s, the entire world was looking at the Pacific Northwest. The Seattle grunge explosion had taken over MTV, the radio, and the record industry. But for Mark Lanegan, the frontman of Screaming Trees, it wasn't a glamorous rock revolution. It was a desperate, drug-fueled grind to escape a dead-end life. Lanegan despised his hometown of Ellensburg, Washington, calling it a redneck town filled with right-wing, white trash hay farmers and cattlemen. He hated it from his earliest memories, and the only thing that could get him out of there was the band. But behind the scenes, Lanegan was intensely dissatisfied with the music Screaming Trees was churning out, later referring to it as swill compared to the deeply moving music his peers were making. While the rest of the world saw him as a grunge pioneer, Lanegan was navigating the darkest underbelly of the Seattle scene. One day, while trying to score heroin in a stairwell, he bumped into Layne Staley, the singer of Alice in Chains. They had never formally met, but knew each other by sight. Layne shot him a sly smile and asked, "Are you here for what I'm here for?" When Mark headed up the stairs, Layne told him to head down, saying, "There's better shit down here, and cheaper." Layne hooked Mark up with a new connection right then and there, sparking what Lanegan called the beginning of a beautiful friendship. This wasn't the MTV version of Seattle. This was the razor's edge between beauty and total annihilation. To understand how Mark Lanegan survived the 90s, you have to understand that his darkness wasn't a product of the Seattle grunge era. It was baked into him from childhood. Both of his parents came from backgrounds of extreme poverty and cruel deprivation. Growing up in that redneck farming town, Mark was a fiercely guarded kid. By the time he was in grade school, his teachers, coaches, and acquaintances strictly referred to him by his surname, Lanegan. He wasn't dreaming of rock stardom. As a young kid, rummaging underneath the bleachers at the local college football field, he was already cultivating elaborate, secret obsessions. He shoplifted a jar of India ink from the college bookstore, wrapped a sewing needle in thread, and began tattooing himself with crude, jailhouse-looking ink, knowing exactly what kind of man he was going to become. When he got his hands on a copy of William Burroughs' legendary gritty novel, Junkie, Lanegan didn't view it as a cautionary tale. He read it and knew, right then and there, that he would also be a heroin addict someday. The die was cast long before he ever picked up a microphone. Screaming Trees wasn't his introduction to the underworld. It was just his ticket to a bigger one. Mark didn't view himself as a rock star. In fact, he envied the generation of musicians coming up around him. When he first crossed paths with a young Kurt Cobain, Lanegan was completely blown away. After watching Nirvana, Mark handed Kurt a scrap of paper with his name on it and told him to call. Mark walked back to his depressing hovel that night with a newfound buoyancy, convinced he had just experienced something touched by greatness. The two quickly became close, spending hours on long phone calls talking about girls, music, and life. But Nirvana was volatile in the early days. Out of nowhere, Mark received a phone call from a nervous-sounding Chris Novoselic. The Nirvana bassist told Mark that he couldn't stand playing with Kurt anymore, that he was sick of everything having to be Kurt's way, and asked if Mark was still looking for a bass player. Lanegan could have poached the bassist of the band that was about to change the world. Instead, he told Chris that while he loved his style, he needed to get past his problems with Kurt and make it work because Nirvana had something special. Mark never told Kurt about that phone call. He kept his mouth shut because he loved Kurt, and he deeply envied him. To Lanegan, the difference between Nirvana and Screaming Trees was painfully obvious. Nirvana was fully developed from the very first moment he heard them, while Mark was fighting a maddening daily battle just to try and force his own band's melodies to hold some sort of personal meaning. Mark and Kurt Cobain's bond went much deeper than just hanging out at dive bars. They were actually supposed to be in a band together. Long before Nirvana reached stadium status, Mark and Kurt started working on a side project, an album composed entirely of covers by the legendary blues artist Lead Belly. They actually got into the studio together, but the project was eventually aborted because of their chaotic schedules and escalating habits. But the sessions weren't a total loss. Mark took an acoustic track they had worked on, a heavy, haunting rendition of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, and put it on his 1990 solo debut, The Winding Sheet. Kurt Cobain came into the studio and sang and played guitar on Mark's version. Mark was the one who introduced Kurt to that specific song. Years later, when Nirvana stripped away the distortion for their legendary MTV Unplugged performance in New York, Kurt closed the show with it, that earth-shattering vocal performance that defined a generation. It started as a scrapped jam session with Mark Lanegan. While Screaming Trees was getting Mark out of Ellensburg, he was drowning in the dysfunction of the band. They weren't just a group, they were a volatile, oversized family. Mark's bandmates were the Connor brothers, Van and Lee, a family of 7 kids, where 4 of them were abnormally large for their age. Mark found out exactly what he had signed up for during their very first show in Western Washington. From the very first note, guitarist Lee Connor went absolutely nuts. He was stomping, windmilling, and rampaging across the stage like a maniac. Mark's jaw dropped at the sheer audacity of it, and so did the audiences. That raw energy caught the attention of the legendary punk label SST Records. Their first tours were opening slots for Firehose, the new band of Minutemen bassist Mike Watt, who took an instant liking to them because the oversized Connor boys reminded him of his late bandmate D. Boone. The reality of the road, however, was grueling. Their payment for the first SST tour was $100 a night. For the second tour, they were bumped up to $200. It was just barely enough money to pay for gasoline, with the entire band occasionally sharing a single room at a Motel 6. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, Mark was watching history unfold. One night, he went down to a dingy rock dive called The Vogue to watch Nirvana play. They were the first band on a 3-band bill for Sub Pop Records. Mark couldn't believe it. He found it unfathomable that the label forced Nirvana to open for obviously inferior music. Kurt hated it too. Sub Pop was dictating what songs Nirvana should record, picking their album covers, and even telling them what to title their records. Desperate for creative control, Kurt asked Mark to talk to the head of SST Records, Greg Ginn, to try and get Nirvana a deal. Mark made the pitch, and to his utter disbelief, Greg Ginn passed. He was not interested at all in signing Nirvana. Despite the internal dysfunction, the music industry machine eventually caught up with Screaming Trees. In 1992, filmmaker Cameron Crowe released the movie Singles, a love letter to the Seattle grunge scene. He included a Screaming Trees track called Nearly Lost You on the soundtrack. The soundtrack exploded, and suddenly, Nearly Lost You was everywhere.
Ladies and gentlemen, here they are, Screaming Trees.
It was a massive alternative rock hit, put into heavy rotation on MTV and mainstream radio. But for Mark, it was an albatross. While the world looked at Screaming Trees and saw rising rock stars, Mark felt like a fraud, trapped in a band he couldn't stand, singing a song he quickly grew to despise, all while his personal life descended into total chaos. As Nirvana was quietly gearing up to take over the world, Mark was falling deeper into the Seattle underworld. Screaming Trees had signed with a new manager, Susan Silver, and began rehearsing in a rented basement. Sharing that basement with them were 2 of Susan's other clients, Soundgarden and Alice in Chains. It was here that Mark's friendship with Layne Staley shifted from occasional drug deals to full-blown co-destruction. In November of 1992, Screaming Trees hit the road for a 2-month US tour, sandwiched in the middle slot between the opener Grunt Truck and the headliners, Alice in Chains. Offstage, the tour was an insane, dark, drug and alcohol-fueled frat party from start to finish. Mark and Layne spent the entire 2 months raising hell, behaving like teenagers, and staying awake for days on end. They partook in absolutely whatever drugs crossed their path. Heroin, cocaine, pills, it didn't matter. The partying on that Alice in Chains tour eventually crossed the line. One night, while riding on Alice's bus with Layne, the 2 of them got so completely shit-faced that they tore apart the back lounge in a drunken frenzy, leaving a massive, destructive mess. The next day, Susan Silver, who was co-managing Alice in Chains, came out to the tour. She cornered Mark and gave him a stern talking to, telling him that he and Layne were going to clean up the mess immediately, and that Mark was officially banned from riding on their bus. But what blew Mark's mind wasn't the reprimand, it was the duality of Layne Staley. Despite the fact that Layne was physically falling apart behind the scenes, the moment he stepped on a stage, he transformed. Mark watched from the wings and admitted he witnessed some of the greatest performances he had ever seen by anyone. He described Alice in Chains as a massive, apocalyptic machine. It didn't matter what shape Layne was in or how little sleep they'd had. Layne would fucking kill it every single night. Backed by Jerry Cantrell's powerful, nuanced vocal harmonies, they possessed a haunting, one-of-a-kind quality that Mark knew could never be replicated. While Screaming Trees were constantly on the verge of imploding, Mark was quietly building his own deeply personal legacy. He stepped away from the band's screaming psychedelic rock to record dark, brooding acoustic solo albums. But even on his own, the chaos of the Seattle Brotherhood followed him everywhere. During the European festival season of 1992, Mark found himself backstage at the massive Roskilde festival in Denmark. He met up with Pearl Jam guitarist Mike McCready and Trees bassist Van Conner, and the three of them got absolutely wasted, drinking all day long behind the scenes of one of the biggest rock festivals in the world. Despite the constant blackouts, Mark managed to pour his pain into a solo record called Whiskey for the Holy Ghost. It was a bleak, haunting, and agonizing masterpiece. But that album would eventually become the source of one of his deepest traumas. But creating that solo masterpiece nearly broke him. Mark was such a perfectionist, and so deeply consumed by his addictions, that the recording process was pure agony. He obsessed over every single vocal take, driving his producers insane. At one point, he was so frustrated and unhinged that he grabbed the master tapes, walked out of the studio, and fully intended to throw them into a rushing river to destroy the album completely. The producer literally had to tackle him to the ground in the dirt and physically wrestle the tapes away from him just to save the record. Weeks after Kurt Cobain's death, Mark was dealing with Courtney Love calling him for emotional support. During one of those calls, Courtney dropped a piece of information that horrified Mark. She told him that in the weeks leading up to his death, Kurt had been obsessively listening to Whiskey for the Holy Ghost. Mark was totally devastated. He had already felt crushing guilt for dodging Kurt's final phone calls, but the thought that his own dark, depressive music might have somehow fueled his best friend's suicidal state shattered Mark's already stunned psyche. By the mid-90s, Mark Lanegan wasn't just a rock frontman. He had become known as the guy who could procure drugs for traveling rock bands. When massive festivals like Lollapalooza rolled through Washington, musicians sought Mark out. He hooked up members of the band L7 and even scored for his musical idol, Nick Cave, and the Bad Seeds bassist Martin Casey on their day off in Seattle. Because of his talent for finding veins, Mark was usually the guy asked to give somebody a shot when they couldn't do it themselves. Whenever he was hanging out with Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love, Courtney would have Mark find her vein. Mark noted that this task was always made significantly more difficult by Courtney's non-stop talking or complaining. But that proximity came with a heavy, exhausting price. Mark had become conditioned to steer clear of Kurt and Courtney's house because every single time he visited, drama would erupt. It unfolded like a dreary sitcom joke where Courtney would be uncomfortably friendly to Mark in front of Kurt, just to trigger an outburst from her husband. This toxic dynamic led to the greatest regret of Mark Lanegan's life. In early April 1994, Kurt checked himself out of rehab, flew back to Seattle, and went missing. But Kurt did try to get in touch with Mark. Kurt called him and asked if he'd come over to the house and listen to music. Mark thought about it. He loved Kurt, but he had cash and plenty of dope, and was in no mood to go score for somebody. More importantly, Mark assumed Courtney would be there. Mark blew Kurt off because he simply didn't feel like playing the pawn in their fucked up chess game that day. Kurt called 2 more times over the next couple of hours. Mark ignored him, despite a gnawing feeling in his gut. Not long after those unanswered calls, Kurt Cobain was found dead. The fallout from Kurt's death didn't just bring grief, it brought a suffocating paranoia to the Seattle scene. The media descended like vultures. Everyone was looking for someone to blame, and the tight-knit circle of musicians suddenly found themselves living under a microscope. Mark retreated even further into the shadows. He watched as the industry tried to sanitize Kurt's image and commodify his tragedy. For a guy who was already dealing with his own massive demons, The circus surrounding Seattle became unbearable. It accelerated his spiral, pushing him further away from the spotlight. Even after Kurt's death, the machinery of the 1990s music industry kept grinding forward. For Mark Lanegan, the juxtaposition between the glamorous rock star lifestyle he was supposed to be living and the grim reality of his daily existence reached a boiling point. In September of 1996, Screaming Trees were booked for a massive East Coast arena tour. They were opening for the British superstars Oasis. But from the very beginning, the tour was fraught with tension, specifically between Mark and the man he described as Oasis's ignorant, loudmouthed, and obnoxious lead singer, Liam Gallagher. Mark saw right through the Britpop swagger. He recognized that Noel Gallagher was the true genius behind Oasis, a one-man hit factory who wrote all their classic tunes and treated the Trees with common courtesy. Liam, on the other hand, had accidentally stumbled into the high life courtesy of his talented older brother. To Mark, the limelight had uncaged a small, irritating monster without teeth or claws. Liam quickly learned that Screaming Trees were not a band to mess with. Mark noted that the Trees never backed down from anybody, particularly not from a bad actor who exuded fake violence and crybaby fear. While Liam was throwing tantrums, Mark was actively burying the pain of a destroyed life, surviving a private hell that the Gallagher brothers couldn't even fathom. The death of his friends had shattered the Seattle scene, and Mark's nightmare was only accelerating. The lifelong hard-ass exterior he projected to the world was actually an intricately constructed, fiercely guarded sham. Underneath it all, he was merely a child inside the body of an adult, a boy driven by 1,000 forms of fear. By the late 90s, Screaming Trees managed to put out one final album, Dust. It was arguably their best work, a mature, heavy swan song that proved what they were capable of when they weren't trying to kill each other. But it was too late. The Seattle wave had crested and crashed. The band couldn't secure a new record deal, and the industry had moved on. Screaming Trees didn't go out with a massive dramatic explosion. They just quietly bled out. They played their final show in 2000 to a completely disinterested crowd. It was the pathetic whimper of a band that should have conquered the world, but was completely paralyzed by its own dysfunction. The arena tours eventually ended, the crowds disappeared, and Mark Lanegan fell completely off the map. He plummeted into the deepest corners of the criminal underworld. He found himself living alone in an apartment covered in crack pipes, with a huge pile of used syringes sitting right on the coffee table. The physical reality of Mark's addiction had become a waking horror show. His body was completely breaking down. At one point, a massive, festering infection left him hospitalized and facing the very real threat of imminent amputation. He was laid up in a grimy, soot-covered hospital hallway, bored to death with sick, elderly, French-speaking homeless people as his only companions. He watched unfortunate souls forced to use bedpans in plain view, in a place that constantly stank like a hole-in-the-floor gas station toilet. The glamorous rock star facade was entirely gone. He was just another junkie, waiting for his body to finally give up. One morning, while detained by police on the street, an officer took a hard look at him and asked, "Didn't you used to be a singer?" It wasn't long before Mark was fully living on the streets. He began a relationship and a scam with a homeless crack addict who went by the name Shadow. Mark witnessed firsthand how dangerous life was for a homeless woman in the 90s Northwest, a hunting ground rife with sadistic Johns and active serial killers. To survive, Mark was reduced to hustling. He frequented a local pawn shop owned by a family man named Rob, who had a soft spot for Mark and would pretend to believe his bullshit excuses for where he got the stolen items. But you can never truly outrun your past in Seattle. One day, Rob pulled Mark into the back room of the pawn shop. He told Mark that Courtney Love had walked into the shop looking for him. Despite all the bad blood and the devastating loss of Kurt, Courtney had come looking for the man who ignored her husband's final phone calls. She left literature with the pawn shop owner for a program in California that helped musicians with drug problems, offering to put Mark through rehab. He looked at the pawn shop owner and said, "Fuck that shit. You can tell her to shove her rehab." Mark Lanegan's pride told Courtney Love to shove her rehab, but his reality was unavoidable. Yet, even at his absolute lowest, the Rock and Roll Brotherhood refused to let him die on the street. One day, Mark returned from a brutal shift doing demolition on old buildings in East Los Angeles. He walked up to his place to find someone waiting for him on the porch. It was a fellow musician from Seattle whom he had never even met. This musician had heard about Mark's terrifying living situation and, acting completely on impulse, had come looking for him. It was Duff McKagan, the bass player for Guns N' Roses. At a time when Mark was completely unwelcome in the houses of almost everyone who had known him before, Duff befriended him and took him under his wing like a guardian angel. Mark had been sleeping on an uncomfortable, thin wool blanket covering a bare canvas army cot in a fume-filled art studio. Duff pulled him out of that squalor. He asked Mark to stay at his homes to keep an eye on things. It became a bizarre, life-saving arrangement. When Duff's family was in Los Angeles, Mark would live in and watch his house in Seattle. When they returned to Seattle, Mark would go to Los Angeles and do the exact same thing there. Duff McKagan literally put a roof over the head of a man the rest of the industry had written off. Mark was even at the Seattle house when Duff married his girlfriend. It wasn't just the stadium giants like Duff McKagan keeping Mark tethered to reality. Salvation also came from the new blood in the scene. During the grueling final days of Screaming Trees, the band had hired a young kid to play second guitar. His name was Josh Homme. Mark wholeheartedly endorsed the decision. The atmosphere in Screaming Trees at that point was toxic. None of the old-timers enjoyed each other's company anymore. Mark spent almost every second on the tour bus completely alone in the back lounge, smoking crack and shooting dope. Josh Homme was just a kid. He had a youngster's passing interest in partying, but he had zero experience with Mark's heavy world. Yet, out of sheer boredom and curiosity, Josh began hanging out in the back lounge with Mark, watching him do drugs and just talking. Through those dark conversations, a profound bond was formed. Josh quickly realized that the rest of the Screaming Trees were going through the motions. Despite Mark's glaring, terrifying addictions, Josh saw that Mark was the only one in the band who still cared enough to try and do his best when it came to the music. That mutual respect, in the darkest of times, laid the foundation for the next chapter of rock history. Josh Homme never forgot the connection he made with Lanegan in the back of that Screaming Trees tour bus. When he formed Queens of the Stone Age, he didn't leave Mark in the past. He brought him right into the fold. He physically pulled him out of the Pacific Northwest and brought him to the California desert. He invited Mark to participate in the Desert Sessions, a loose, psychedelic collective of musicians jamming out at a remote studio called Rancho de la Luna. Out in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the rain, the heroin, and the ghosts of Seattle, Mark finally found a profound sense of creative freedom. There were no corporate executives dictating their sound, and no bandmates throwing punches. It was pure, unfiltered creation. The blazing desert sun quite literally burned the Seattle gloom right out of him, setting the stage for his massive second act. Lanegan became a full-time member of Queens of the Stone Age, just in time for their massive, landscape-shifting 2002 album, Songs for the Deaf. Mark's menacing, rumbling rasp became the dark anchor of the record. While the Seattle grunge era had faded into the history books, Mark Lanegan had seamlessly transitioned into being a core member of the most dangerous rock band of the early 2000s. Once Mark Lanegan finally got clean, he didn't just casually return to music. He attacked it with a desperate, relentless fury. It was as if he knew he had cheated death, and he had to make up for 2 decades of lost time. He earned the nickname Dark Mark, and his output became absolutely staggering. Over the next 20 years, he released 12 critically acclaimed solo albums. He didn't chase radio hits, he built a massive cult following. This relentless drive culminated in 2004 with the release of his solo album Bubblegum. It was a towering, heavy, industrial-tinged masterpiece, and it proved exactly how much respect Mark commanded in the industry. The record featured a staggering lineup of guests, including Josh Homme, PJ Harvey, and Duff McKagan. It wasn't a grunge nostalgia trip, it was a gritty, forward-looking statement from a man who had finally taken absolute control of his own musical destiny. Bubblegum cemented him not just as a survivor, but as a genuine rock and roll auteur. He became the underground's favorite weapon. He formed the Gutter Twins with Greg Dully, He recorded multiple albums with the British production duo Soul Savers. He proved that the grunge era didn't define him, it was just his brutal origin story. But Mark didn't have to face this new era alone. He found a kindred spirit in Greg Dully, the frontman of the Afghan Whigs. Dully wasn't just a collaborator, he became one of Mark's fiercest protectors and closest friends. They were two sides of the same dark coin, both survivors of the 90s alt-rock meat grinder. Together they formed the Gutter Twins. Their bond was rooted in a shared understanding of addiction, survival, and a mutual refusal to surrender. When the rest of the world had turned its back on Mark during his darkest periods, Dully was one of the guys who kept the porch light on for him. For decades, Mark Lanegan refused to talk about the 90s. He hated the word grunge, he hated the romanticization of the era, and he fiercely guarded the dark truths about what really happened to his friends. So why, in 2020, did he finally sit down and write a brutally honest memoir? The answer was Anthony Bourdain. The legendary chef and television host had been a massive fan of Lanegan's music for years. When they finally met, the two men formed an incredibly tight bond. Bourdain recognized the raw, unflinching honesty in Lanegan and relentlessly pushed him to write a book. Bourdain knew that Mark was one of the last men standing who could tell the true story of Seattle without sugarcoating the ugliness. When Bourdain tragically took his own life in 2018, Lanegan was devastated. But losing his closest confidant gave him the final push he needed. He finished Sing Backwards and Weep, dedicating the painstaking traumatic process to Bourdain's memory. It was Mark's way of finally emptying the vault, laying his ghosts to rest, and fulfilling a promise to a friend. By 2020, Mark Lanegan was officially rock's great survivor. He published his memoir, laying bare the brutal, unvarnished truth of his life. He didn't romanticize his addictions or the Seattle scene. He blamed himself for his choices and told the ugly truth. Seeking an escape from the noise of Los Angeles, Mark and his second wife moved across the world to a quiet home in Killarney, Ireland. Mark finally found a deep sense of peace there, reportedly declaring that he never wanted to return to LA. But his lifelong nemesis, total annihilation, was not finished with him yet. In early 2021, Mark contracted a devastating, life-threatening illness. For a man whose lungs were already deeply compromised from decades of heavy smoking and bodily abuse, Mark was completely dismantled. He lost his hearing, he lost his ability to walk. He was admitted to a hospital in County Kerry, Ireland, where doctors were forced to put him into a medically induced coma. He remained hovering between life and death for months. While hooked up to machines in the intensive care unit, Mark experienced intense, visceral hallucinations. He later wrote that he was trapped in waking nightmares, seeing visions of himself wandering through desolate, icy landscapes. At one critical juncture, the doctors approached his wife, Shelley, and suggested performing a tracheostomy to help him breathe, but they warned her that the procedure would permanently alter his vocal cords. Shelley refused. She knew her husband better than anyone. After 37 years of touring, bleeding, and surviving for his art, his gravelly voice was his entire identity. If he lost his voice, he lost himself. Miraculously, Mark woke up. He survived the fever dreams, the cracked ribs from a terrifying fall, and the endless months in the intensive care unit. True to form, even while profoundly deaf and barely able to breathe, his instinct was to create. He demanded his phone and began typing out the poetry and prose that would become his 2021 book, Devil in a Coma. He documented every ounce of the suffering, refusing to let the illness rob him of his final words. Mark Lanegan eventually signed himself out of the hospital, stubbornly determined to finish his recovery on his own terms at his home in Ireland. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the ultimate survivor had beaten the Reaper one last time. But the physical toll of his wild, chaotic life had simply asked too much of his body. On February 22, 2022, Mark Lanegan passed away at his home in Killarney. He was 57 years old, and the exact cause of death was never revealed. The music world stopped. Tributes poured in from across the globe, mourning him not just as the former singer of Screaming Trees, but as one of the most uniquely gifted artists of his generation. Mark Lanegan outlived Kurt Cobain, He outlived Layne Staley. He outlived the entire grunge machine that tried to swallow him whole. He dragged his scuffed boots down the bleakest, darkest byways of the music industry, survived the absolute worst of human addiction, and lived just long enough to leave us the honest, bloody truth.